Learning Mandarin finals is mostly about understanding how vowels work and how they are combined. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to focus on Mandarin finals and how to pronounce them. But before that, I am going to talk a little bit about my pronunciation course, which opens for registration today and remains open for the duration of the week. So that's until Sunday, February the 26th. For more information about the course, head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com or follow the link in the description. If you happen to listen in the future, you can still head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com and see what the current status of the course is. And if it is closed, you can still sign up for the waiting list, which will make sure you get notifications when the course opens again. So this is a video course that covers all aspects of pronunciation. So in Mandarin, that would be tones, initials, finals, and prosody. So the first three are part of the basic syllable in Mandarin. We have an initial that starts the syllable, as the name implies. We have a final that ends it, and then we also have a tone. So later in this episode, after I finish talking about the course itself, we will talk about the finals. In the course, I go through all these things in great detail in video episodes and also with exercises and other materials that you can use. There is also a whole section about how to learn pronunciation that gives you the tools and the methods you need to perfect your pronunciation if you've been learning for a while, or learn it from scratch if you just started with Mandarin. The course is meant for all levels of learners, so from beginner up to more advanced levels. And if you're a beginner, of course, everything will be new and it will take a long time to work your way through the course. There's a lot of stuff covering things that you maybe not need to know as a beginner, but which is great to know that it is there for the day when you actually do need it. Working your way through all the videos, the related exercises, and so on should take you 50 to 100 hours maybe, but of course this is not something you're expected to do in a short period of time. Indeed, I recommend people to watch certain parts of the course, come back later, continue at a later date when you've mastered something and feel ready to move on, or indeed when you spot a specific problem and you want to learn more about how to deal with that specific problem. And that's the way most more advanced students will use the course. There will of course be many things in the course that are obvious for you because you're not a beginner, but since everything is there, it's good to know that no matter which specific part you happen to have an issue with, it will be covered. There are two versions of the course. One is the basic video course, and that contains everything I've just mentioned. And then there is also an extra option to get feedback directly from me on your pronunciation. And depending on if you're a beginner or more advanced learner, this works slightly differently. So if you're a beginner, you submit recordings throughout the course and I give you feedback to see how much you've learned of what's covered in the course. But if you're a more advanced student, this doesn't really make sense because you're not going to work your way through the course in the order it is presented. You are rather going to focus on things you really need to focus on. And that's obviously where the feedback comes in because many people don't really know what their issues are, or they might know vaguely that they have some problem in some area. So what I do is a thorough check to see how you're doing in all the areas I just mentioned. So I'm checking single syllables, words, sentences, and more freely produced speech. I then present you with a highly detailed report showing you exactly what you're doing well and where there is room for improvement. And I also help you to pick 3 priority areas that I think is extra important that you start working with immediately in order to improve your ability to communicate clearly in Mandarin. Regardless of which type of feedback you choose, you will then also receive follow-up feedback after you've had a chance to practice the things that I highlighted. So the pronunciation course is open until February 26th, but there is no expiration date on the content itself. So once you're enrolled, you can always access the videos, the exercises, and so on. And that goes for the feedback options too. So if you want to get your feedback immediately and then work your way through the course based on that feedback, that's okay. If you want to wait a bit or you want to work your way through the course and then get some feedback, that's okay too. So I think that's enough information about the pronunciation course. You can always find more at pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. But now I think it's time to turn to the other part of this episode, which is meant to be about finals. And I am going to include the audio from one of the lessons in the course later in this episode. But before we listen to that, I'd like to introduce a few important things about finals, and these are things that are covered in other places in the course, and I think they are kind of necessary to know before we start talking about specific finals. So finals in Mandarin are usually made up of one or more vowel sounds. This means that if you learn the basic vowel sounds and how they are combined, you will be able to pronounce almost all the finals, provided that you're using the right method. And one of the things I mean by that is that we need to separate how something is spelt from how it is pronounced. These are two different things, and they tend to trip up students of Mandarin a lot. I've spent hundreds of hours giving feedback to students on their pronunciation, either in this course or as part of my teaching in general. And one of the most common issues is simply that people don't know the link between the written word and the spoken sound. This gives rise to a situation where people simply read pinyin and assume that it works the way their native language does. And that's almost never the case. There are always small differences, and sometimes there are very big differences. So instead of just reading pinyin, your pronunciation practice should be based on listening and mimicking first. Those are by far the best way of learning pronunciation, and they are also completely free. When you know how something is supposed to sound, you can then learn how it's written, and this is not as transparent as one might have hoped. For example, we have many situations where we have several vowel sounds that are written using a single letter in pinyin. And this really goes for most of the vowels, but just to name 3 examples, E and I can respectively stand for 4 different types of sounds, and then we also have A, which can stand in for at least 3 different sounds. So it should be clear that you can't really sound out these syllables based on which letters they contain. And this should be very obvious for people who have studied pronunciation a bit, either in Mandarin or in other languages, but this is not obvious for most students, which is why I'm saying it. Don't read pinyin as if it were your native language, and don't assume that a certain final is pronounced in a certain way because it contains certain letters that you think you know how to pronounce, because this is often not the case. If you listen and mimic more, you will not have this problem, or at least it won't be as severe, because you will pay attention to what people actually say, not what it says on the page. We also have the reverse of this when one single vowel sound is spelled using different letters, which also trips people up. The best example is of course U, which is sometimes spelled with dots above a U or sometimes just with a U. So in a word like lu, a road, you don't have the dots and there is a U sound, nothing strange. But then when you add the dots, we get lu. So far so good. But then after J, Q and X, we don't have these dots, but it's still pronounced U, so we have Ju, Chu and Xu, and it's not an U sound anymore. And these are things you have to learn. So when you learn pinyin, you have to make sure you understand the spelling rules and learn them well. Naturally, in my pronunciation course, I go through all the initials and finals and explain their spelling and how it's linked to the sounds and so on. And I can't do that in this podcast episode, but like I said, we are going to listen to a few of them now. So the audio that I'm going to include in this episode comes from lesson 2 in section 4, so this is pretty deep into the course. And if you've followed all the lessons up until this point, you already have a pretty good idea of how sounds are produced. And this is something that I think is important for adult learners of foreign languages. It really pays off to have basic knowledge of how your mouth works and how moving your tongue in a certain way produces different sounds. You don't need to have theoretical deep knowledge and write papers in phonetics and so on, but having this basic knowledge of how, say, vowels work really helps when it comes to figuring out how to pronounce things more like a native speaker of Mandarin than a native speaker of, say, English. Some people are very good at mimicking, and if you're one of them, you might be able to mostly hit the right sound simply by paying attention and mimicking very closely. But for most adult students, this doesn't really work, and then adding a little bit of theoretical understanding really helps. And it isn't all that theoretical either, it's more about moving your tongue around in your own mouth and listening to what comes out, and somewhat understanding the link between the two. So we are going to listen to the audio from this lesson, but it is of course a video lesson, which means that I refer to some things shown on screen that you can't see in this podcast episode. If you look at the cover image of this episode, you will see most of what you need to see though, and this is a chart showing the vowel space. So it's basically a square that has been slightly squeezed at the bottom, and then things on the left are closer to your teeth, so those would be front vowels, and then towards the right would be further into your mouth, so that would be back vowels. And then if we move up, that represents upwards tongue movement then, and down represents further down in your mouth. Lesson 2 in this section focuses on finals starting with the letter A, and those are pretty basic, and there's a reason I start with the easiest sounds first. This is a pedagogical strategy that I use throughout the course. I build up your understanding of how things work with the easiest things first, and then we work our way up to more complicated things. So while many of you might not struggle with the specific finals mentioned in this lesson, the goal here is to show pedagogically sound explanations of how these sounds actually work and how you can produce them, and of course I use that for the trickier sounds too. And this is also the area I receive the most positive feedback from students in the course, i.e. that the explanations are very clear and that they make sense and help people understand things that they've just had a hazy idea of before. Okay, that's enough of a preamble, so let's get started. Hello and welcome to Section 4 Finals, Lesson 2, Combinations with A. So now we're going to start looking at various combinations of the basic sounds, and we're starting with those that are spelled with A. And so here are some questions we're going to answer. So first we're going to go through these basic combinations, and that's I, ow, an, and ang. So those 4. We are also going to look at maybe some spelling rules, or at least talk about spelling rules a little bit. So let's recap briefly what we talked about vowels in the previous lesson. And I know I did this in the previous lesson, I'm just doing it here because this is typically not something you can just listen to once or even do once and then you just get it. It takes a while and you need to experiment a bit. But just to remind ourselves of the basics, tongue position creates different vowels. So how we position the tongue, how far forward, how far back it is, and we use the words close and open to mean how far up or down it is, and then front and back to say how far forward or back in the mouth it is. And of course, we've also talked about lip rounding, which is not really something we need to worry about in this lesson, but we will talk about it in future lessons. So let's look at this chart again, and just as a reminder, it is a side view. So you're looking at it like that. So the front is of course close to your teeth. So if you say something like e, you should feel that your tongue is pretty far forward. And if you say u, you should feel that it's pretty far back. And if you transition between those two, e, u, you should feel your tongue moving back and forth. You are also rounding your lips for u, but that is not really relevant here. I'm after the position of the tongue here. So yeah. And this is something that sounds stupid when you're doing it, but it can be kind of fun too. And the thing is that you can say these sounds. That's not really the problem. I mean, most of us speak all the time and make similar noises all day. But it's a different thing to just say them and do it intuitively and be able to feel what it is that creates these differences. What are you doing with your tongue that makes these different sounds come out? And like I've said, this is something that will help you when you're dealing with sounds that are actually quite difficult, because then you can kind of control what you're saying in a different way. It's not like you're just listening and hearing something weird and you try to say it and you have no idea why it sounds like that or what comes out or how to indeed to make the sound. So it is quite helpful to experiment with this, maybe not in public transport, but it is kind of nice to play around with this and learn a bit about how this works. And next, if we go from close to open, we can go from E to A, ya, like that. So do that a few times. Yeah, and we pass through yeah, and so on. Yeah, and so on, if you want to make it more, gradual. So let's move on. Well, I should say that we also have the upside down E in the middle. That's not really part of this, it's just a relaxed central vowel. And then you can also note that we have 2 different A sounds, and I will get back to that in a second. So one is front and one is back. But as this chart indicates, the difference between the two is not that big. It's not even close as big as the difference between E and U, for example, which is very big. Okay, so let's look at our first combination. And so this is spelled AI in pinyin and is pronounced I. And this is nothing strange here, it's just a combination of these two, so it doesn't behave in any unexpected way or anything. So I, So can you feel that your tongue is moving in the direction of the arrow? So I, like that. So let's look at a few examples. There is nothing else really here going on. It's just straight transition, as I said. So, for example, to love is I. And then we have to come, lie. And then we have to buy, my. And maybe you could hear this here, but it's usually the case that we don't go all the way up to E. So people don't say I, and they don't say lie, and they don't say my. You stop a little bit short of that. So when I said to buy, for example, I said my. You stop a little bit short of the extreme here. So let's move on to the next one. All the ones we're dealing with in this lesson, all of course start at the bottom with these A sounds. That's why they are in this lesson. So the next one is spelled A-O in pinyin, and it's pronounced ow, ow, ow. So maybe you can hear that this ah sound is further back. Ow, ow. But still, it's still a straight transition. So nothing really strange going on here. So the first word we have is ow, ow. To be proud or proud, ow. And then we have how, good, how. And then finally, gao, tall, gao. And here we can maybe bring up an example of how small differences in vowels can be heard, even though they are not maybe used to distinguish words. So it's not like someone will misunderstand what you say, but it can, sound less like Mandarin and more like, say, English if you make mistakes like this. So for example, the word how in English, like how are you doing, it's not as far, the middle sound here, the vowel sound, the start of it, is not as far back as it is in Mandarin. So if I say how in English and then how, you can hear that it's farther back, how. And so this is not a major difference, but it should be farther back. And now that we also see why it's useful to be able to know these basic terms, because if I tell you, hey, you should make your a little bit further back, you kind of know what I mean now. Whereas if you say that to someone who hasn't thought about these things at all, maybe they can guess what a back vowel is, but it's not obvious, right? So knowing a little bit about this makes it much easier to get accurate feedback, because I can basically tell you where to put your tongue, and you can at least go in that direction. So let's look at the next one. So this is an, and here we have the first case where it's not a vowel at the end, right? We have a, which is clearly a vowel, and then we have n, which is not a vowel. And I've tried to indicate this with this type of arrow here, and you see that it goes outside of the chart. So we know that E is at the very upper left corner here, right? But when we say an, we go past that and we touch the roof of the mouth, right? So if you try to say an E and you keep going upwards, so if you start with a and then we go upwards to E and then you just keep going, what happens? Okay, we stop the sound because you close the airstream, right? And that's what we do with consonants. We talked about that in section 3. So n here is just trying to indicate that the vowel ends here and we get to an n instead. I'm not saying you should go, you're not saying ein, of course. It's just a way, I'm just explaining what I mean by this type of chart here. So an, just a straight transition from a to n, an. And we have some words here, of course. So an means to press, an. And then we have shan, mountain, shan. And then finally we have lan, blue, lan. And you should be able to feel that your tongue is going from the a and then closing. Next up, we have the cousin of the previous sound, which is the same thing, but now back. So we're going from the back a and then up to and is, well, as far back as you can make it almost. So ang, and it's a straight transition again, provided that you have the right start here and the right end, it should be fine. And we have a few words here, so ang, hi, ang, and if you're very busy, you are mang. And then finally you can fang something, to put it, fang. And here also is a good reminder that you have to care about what these letters here mean. So the a sound here is a back sound, like we've talked about, that's the kind of the point here. So in fang, for example. But we can take a word in English like fang, like another word for tooth, right? So a beast has fangs. So this fang is obviously not the same as fang. So if I were to say both with kind of a fourth tone, so fang in English, that has a front vowel and a kind of sound, fang. It's not fang, so this is fang at the very back, fang. And again, these are not things that will make people not understand you at all, but they are things that makes it doesn't sound very Mandarin. It sounds more like someone reading pinyin. So don't do that. Try to listen to the sounds and mimic. So what did we learn in this lesson? Well, we learned that most of these are actually straight combinations. So I, for example, is just a plus I, easy, I. And then we saw that a plus o is ao, ao. Not very hard either, but we should remember to stick close to the back of the mouth here. Ao. And then we saw that an is also a combination of a and n, an. And then finally the same thing for a and ang, except that the n and the a are both back, so ang. And actually there are no spelling rules as such, so if you see these finals, you can be sure how they are pronounced. They are always pronounced like this. We will see in some later lessons that there are finals that can be spelled in different ways, or several finals that are spelled the same way, but that is not true here. You can safely rely on these. However, be aware of just because it says an A, you cannot just assume that it is, what you would expect it to be based on your native language. We saw that with fang in Chinese and fang, for example, in English. They are spelled exactly the same way, but they are not pronounced the same way. So thank you so much for watching, 谢谢收看, and see you in the next lesson. Okay, so that was lesson 2 in section 4 of the pronunciation course. And like I've said earlier, if you want to know more about the course, you can head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.